I wasn't satisfied to just make an interesting film. I wanted it to be a very poetic and meaningful film.
So the process is sort of semi-analytical, well, very analytical, but at the same time just emotional. We are trying to balance calculating analysis against feeling. But it almost never is a question of what does this scene mean. You know, if the thing is truthful, and if it's interesting, and if it still feels like what you were feeling, I find it's much more of an intuitive process, more like what I would imagine writing music is like.
So early on in Kubrick's career, his schedule for knocking films out was pretty similar to other directors of the time. About 2 years, maybe 3 years in between films. And then you see the big shift from his early black and white films into 2001: A Space Odyssey and A Clockwork Orange and there onwards. The gaps became bigger and bigger. And it's not because he was lazy or he was getting a bit older, he was chilling out in England and he had his big estate and he was just kind of like, fuck it, I'm going to chill out, watch whatever sports team he followed on the TV, binge watch some box set series on VHS if it even existed yet, and just chill out. But no, he was, if anything, more obsessed than ever. He had his assistant who played the stepson that got mistreated by Barry Lyndon. He became his assistant and he would basically collect and archive thousands of screenplays and thousands of potential books to be adapted. Obviously everyone knows Kubrick's obsessive, and he became endlessly and increasingly obsessed with getting the right script before doing a film. It had to be perfect, it had to feel perfect, kind of like when he would take endless takes, not necessarily knowing what he wanted, but he knew what he didn't want and he knew what he wanted once he saw it. And you got to think, it's that old saying, perfect is the enemy of good. I kind of wish I'd seen more Kubrick films. Obviously he knew what he was doing, but I do sometimes think like, fuck me, man, maybe you should have just pulled the trigger a few times even when it didn't feel perfect, and make something.
It is fun accumulating the information. As part of the problem that you have to learn something, in depth about something that you start off knowing very little about. Since part of the problem of any story is to make you believe things that are more crucial, like people's, the behavior of the characters in the story. Certainly getting a realistic atmosphere and an interesting atmosphere, especially if it's not a contemporary period, is, just necessary as a starting point.
But what we did get was some incredible films, but he became obsessed and he read for so many scripts, and some of these scripts would catch his eye and potentially be one of his new projects, and one of them was Aryan Papers.
Kubrick had always wanted to make a movie about the war in Europe, and he decided that Wartime Lies was the book that he wanted to use. I have always admired Kubrick as a filmmaker, just boundlessly. So when I was told that it was he who was acquiring the rights, I practically jumped up for joy.
When you read it for the first time, that's your only really pure experience with it, and that's one of the things I like about not writing original material. So then it just becomes almost like a code breaking of breaking the thing down into structure that seems to be, still truthful, not losing, the ideas or the content or the feeling of the book. But it almost never is a question of what does this scene mean. I find it's much more of an intuitive process, more like what I would imagine writing music is like.
So the film would have been set in Nazi-occupied Poland, and it followed a young Jewish boy and his aunt, and they assumed Catholic identities to survive the Holocaust. Obviously, the subject matter being the Holocaust, it was a pretty harrowing subject matter, told through the eyes of a child navigating one of the darkest periods in history. We've talked about Kubrick quite a lot on this show, his obsessive nature. Do you think he had OCD or some sort of...
Yeah, he must have had something, or some sort of spectrum-y thing, like part of what made him brilliant.
Apparently he compiled drawers and drawers of papers about the Holocaust, photos, that you got to think that while doing his research for this film, he would be looking at it every day and like reading through these horrid accounts, and it must have been hard on the mind.
I'm not sure that even Stanley could tell you why he wanted to make a film about the Holocaust. Beyond it's interesting, it's dramatic, it's shocking, it's awful. It had always fascinated it. I mean, what happened in Germany in the 30s and 40s.
Yeah, because that's a funny thing, because you can go two ways. It could beat you down to the point where you're like, oh, I got to tap out of this. Or you could just become desensitized to it. Like when you hear serial killers talk, I mean, they're probably not a good thing to go by because they're psycho, but it always sounds like the first one was hard and then it became easier and easier. If you're digesting something that is fucked up material, you usually become desensitized to it. You know, it becomes less shocking every time rather than the other way around.
As well as compiling all the research and the documents, he had completed casting, location scouting, and even the shooting schedule for Aryan Papers. So really, Declan, this film was quite close to filming beginning on it, and I think the subject matter got to Kubrick. It wore him down. He was struggling with it. And then, of course, around the same time, one of the greatest, if not the greatest, Holocaust-related films came out, Schindler's List. And he went and saw it and just thought, fuck it, I don't think I can do a better job than this. So it never ended up being made. And it's sad, really. Like, I would have loved to see Kubrick's take on a Holocaust film. I've seen loads of Holocaust films. I make myself watch these films because I think it's very important. My recent trip of Normandy, when I was going around the graves and seeing these 17-year-olds, 18-year-olds, some even young, some lied about their age that shouldn't have been enlisted, but they got through the checks and stuff, and it really is grounding. Imagine me going to fucking Waitrose, Declan, to buy like an energy drink or something, and then coming back and watching a film about the Holocaust, and I just sit there and think, boy, you've got it fucking easy. Like, you shouldn't be moaning about fuck all. It's the sense that brings me back to reality when I watch these films. The Pianist is another one, the scenes in the ghettos and stuff like that, and it's such a shame really not to see a master director of Kubrick's levels take on this subject. It would have been fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, what you were saying there, it's like that whole concept of lest we forget that you see on a lot of memorials and war memorials or Holocaust memorials or anything. I remember there was a story of one of the generals when they were first coming across all the concentration camps. One of the generals, like the first thing he said was, get cameras, we need to photograph every body, all the piles of bodies, all the camps, everything. Make sure we got this extensively filmed because the world can't forget about this. They need to know about this. They need to have the physical image of what actually happened. It can't just be stories and numbers and this many people died. You have to hit home with it.
Well, the chess analogy has more to do with like tournament chess, you know, where you have a clock and you have to make a certain number of moves in a certain time where you forfeit, even if you're, you know, a queen ahead or something. You see the grandmaster chess things where the guy, you know, has 3 minutes left on the clock and 10 moves left. And he'll spend, you know, 2 of those minutes on one move, which he knows if he doesn't get that one right, it's going to be lost anyway. And then he makes the last 9 moves, you know, in a minute. You don't have unlimited resources, and they do watch the budget, and, you know, you do have to account for what you're doing.
I can't have a go at Kubrick about the emotionally draining reason for the film not happening. You know, of course it is, especially, you know, he was a Jew. It is probably happened to actual ancestors, or not even ancestors, relatives that were alive at the same time of him. So you can totally get that. But not releasing it because of Schindler's List, like, you get the logic, you get how you might react that way. But, you know, that was the same reason Napoleon never came out, because other studios heard about it, so they were like, oh, fuck it, Kubrick's making a Napoleon film, let's do one as well and release it around the same time. But because he took so long, release around the same time ended up being released before. About 2 or 3 Napoleon films got released before he got to release his, and he was like, ah, fuck it, like, I'm not doing it now. And you just think, like, nah, man, like, just do it anyway, it's probably going to be better.
Well, you know, Stanley, you know, means to me the courage of a singular vision that requires a lot of collaboration to achieve, but doesn't require any collaboration to create. Meaning the Stanley's visions were fiercely singular. Every single movie that Stanley ever made, he explored the subject absolutely to the finite detail. There was nothing left to explore when Stanley was done with a genre. I mean, when you look at 2001 and you look at Barry Lyndon, how can you compare those? You know, when basically you look at Dr. Strangelove and then you look at Clockwork Orange, how do you compare that? These films were not possibly comparable with each other except in terms of his technique as a filmmaker.
Schindler's List came out. We had a similar topic.
and Warner Brothers, Terry Semel and Stanley decided not to come, a few months or a year after Schindler's List with a similar film. We had been burned already on Full Metal Jacket because Platoon was ahead of us.
Obviously, you talked about the control freak element of Kubrick's character. I get the sense that he knew his ability. Because for me personally, if I was that good at directing like he was, even if Spielberg released a film on a similar subject, I'd still be like, well, I'm Stanley Kubrick. My film's going to be better.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. There's not a lot of interviews. There's not a lot of insights with Kubrick. I mean, maybe he was exactly the same off camera, but he seemed kind of guarded, I guess. Maybe that's me projecting, but that's the vibe I got. But he's a human, he gets mythologized. All classics do. Old rockers get a lot more mythologized than modern stars because we see them on social media just being fucking idiots and you're just like, these are not only regular people but fucking dummies a lot of the time. But when there's less of it, you fill in the gaps with your imagination and you make it mysterious and interesting. But, he was just a regular person and might have had his own insecurities and stuff. Maybe that's why also he took so long. It wasn't just the obsession and strive for perfection that made him have such long gaps between projects in his later career, but maybe it was also insecurity and self-doubt and I guess a form of procrastination in the sense where he obviously wasn't sitting around scrolling on his phone being like, fuck it, I'll look at some scripts tomorrow. But he wasn't pulling the trigger. So it's hard to know things like that or what other aspects went into it. It's just frustrating that we didn't get to see another Kubrick film.
The next thing you do is you become a sort of a taste judge, is the balance right? First of all, is it real? And then is it interesting? Does it say what you want to say? And the kind of visual poetry, which actually, as I say, forget what they're doing. It's really visual poetry.
Because Kubrick films were all so crazy, so odd, so unique, and so different from each other. Obviously there's parallels, it's always one single male main character essentially, and certain tropes that he always rolled out, either in stylistically or within the plot or whatever, but they were fucking very different films, completely different genres always, whatever. There's a famous behind the scenes footage of The Shining where Jack Nicholson's rehearsing his lines as Kubrick's on the table next to him rewriting them because he was just constantly changing things. They would take so many takes and let little improvisations play out throughout the series of takes until a lot of the time the final scene looks completely different than the script they were going off when they literally walked onto set that morning.
Marvelous James Joyce quote. He said something about accidents suddenly open up entrances into things that you hadn't thought of, and obviously if you exploit them correctly, they add a dimension to what you're doing, which if you ignore is very limiting.
You can look at the pre-production, hear stories, but even then, you will never know what the film was going to be like because it would have been its own organic thing that just happened between, accidental consequences or just abstractions and just random improvisations on set from Kubrick or the cast or the crew. It's not just that, it would have been a great film. I sit there thinking, what would it have been like?
I think that obsessive nature and that, I don't know if ego is the right word, but it just stops so many potentially legendary films, and it's sad as a film fan.
Anyone who has ever been privileged to direct a film also knows that although it can be like trying to write War and Peace in a bumper car in an amusement park, when you finally get it right, there are not many joys in life that can equal the feeling. But at the same time, I've never been certain whether the moral of the Icarus story should only be, as is generally accepted, don't try to fly too high, or whether it might also be thought of as, forget the wax and feathers and do a better job on the wings.